skeleton jack might catch you in the back and scream like a banshee, make you jump out of your skin.
The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear. Hello everyone and welcome to day 23 of Terrorthon. Today we are going to be discussing one of the most influential horror authors of all time. Some would even argue the most influential. Of course I am referring to H.P. Lovecraft. Creator of all things Lovecraftian, of course, creator of Cthulhu and some of the most famous horror stories in history, and I would like to tell you his story today. So let's start right at the very beginning. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born in 1890, and he had a pretty rough start. For example, his father was institutionalized when Howard was just 3 years old, and then the father died 5 years later. So he had a predisposition to horror, you might say, having lived it. So he lived with his mother, his aunts, and his maternal grandparents, and his mother was permanently stricken with grief and found everything incredibly difficult. His grandfather, Whipple, became the centre of Lovecraft's universe and became his father figure as well. Here's something crazy. H.P. Lovecraft was proficient at reading and writing by the age of 3. Isn't that incredible? And he was encouraged by his grandfather to appreciate literature, especially classical literature and English poetry. And his grandfather would often tell him original weird tales that he'd concocted himself just to entertain the young Lovecraft. And these stories, H.P. Lovecraft reckoned, were originated from Gothic horror. But then, unfortunately, some years later, H.P. Lovecraft's grandmother died, and this absolutely traumatized the young author. His mother and all of his aunts wore black mourning dresses, and this terrified him, but on the plus side, it gave him nightmares which would later inspire his future works. Speaking of his works, he wrote his first one at the age of 7, and he began to be inspired by astrology around this time from books in the family library that he was reading. His first poem to be published appeared in the local newspaper in 1912. And from this point on, letters which he would write to magazines, pulp and weird fiction magazines, especially Argosy, were getting published frequently. And he even got into a famous feud in one of these magazines, a back and forth of letters being sent in, and Lovecraft was recognised by the head editor of the United Amateur Press Association, which he offered Lovecraft to join, which he did. So, he was getting published now, and his first ever short story, The Alchemist, was published in the main UAPA journal. But tragedy would soon follow when his mother was now institutionalized in 1919, and all throughout his life, and especially at this point, Lovecraft had expressed regular suicidal thoughts, so he was really struggling physically and mentally. In 1920, he began publishing the earliest Cthulhu mythos stories, which would later become his trademark and make his name. The Cthulhu stories often contain initially realistic settings before being warped in some way, a sense of cosmic insignificance for mankind, and recurring entities and texts like the Necronomicon, which you have almost certainly heard of. It has been ripped off and stolen for various works, especially Evil Dead, of course. His first in the Cthulhu mythos was The Nameless City, which was published in 1921. And over his lifetime, he would go on to write The Call of Cthulhu, probably his most famous work of all, Supernatural Horror and Literature, which is still a manual that is still followed to this day, The Outsider, The Dunwich Horror, At the Mountains of Madness, and The Shadow over Innsmouth. It would be impossible to name all of his books because he wrote at least 128 of them and hundreds more miscellaneous writings. The bad news in all of this is that his work was essentially unrecognised during his lifetime, and he died penniless, unrecognised, and in agony when intestinal cancer took his life March 15th, 1937, so he was only 47 years old when he died. However, and I think Lovecraft would have approved of this was not the end of his story. In the late 50s and the early 1960s, especially with the counterculture movement going on, Lovecraft's work was finally appreciated, so he became more famous long after his death than he did in life, and I'm very much sure he would have approved of this. He has inspired countless authors, bands, songs, directors, even video games, and the word Lovecraftian has taken on a meaning of its own long after his death. And how many authors can you name that have a whole word describing their style, apart from maybe Kafkaesque? There are entire studies devoted to his work as well. It's just a shame that he wasn't alive to witness any of this. And despite holding several problematic viewpoints, he has become a figurehead of horror literature, and his work will live on forever. And you know what? You want to have a laugh? Go to Google and look up what the name of his cat was. Have fun with that. See you tomorrow.